Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luis Flores. I am a student at McLennan Community College, and I am part of the Honors College. Thank you for joining me today as I discuss what I call or dub how a Texan man in a book exposed corruption in America's justice system. So what exactly am I talking about here? As you see on the right, today I'm going to be discussing a book by The Trial, written by Franz Kafka. And I'm also going to delve into a real-life court case, specifically of Michael Morton, a young man in Texas who was convicted of murdering his wife, only to later find out years later that it was a different man, and he was subsequently released afterwards. My point is, by looking into these court cases, both fictitious and real, I plan to expose the corruption within the American justice system and to also point out how this corruption is related to certain traits of fascism. And so first, I'd like to discuss what specific portion of the American justice system I'm looking into. And specifically, I want to address prosecutorial misconduct. And what this is this illegal or immoral act of a prosecutor. Specifically, what they would ideally do is hide evidence or sway the jury into wrongfully convicting a defendant and imposing a harsher than necessary punishment. And so the idea here is that the prosecutor might do this for several motivations. It could be they just want to win the case, or perhaps there is ego involved within this. Regardless of their intentions of doing this, it is in direct violation of the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which states the rights of criminal defendants, including the right to a public trial without unnecessary delay, the right to a lawyer, the right to an impartial jury, and the right to know who your accusers are, and the most important thing to note here, and the nature of the charges and evidence against you. And both these victims of the court cases we're going to discuss, both Michael Morton of the case of Michael Morton and Joseph K., the main protagonist of the trial, both become victims of prosecutorial misconduct and have their Sixth Amendment violated. And because of the nature of prosecutorial misconduct, I've come to notice that it has traits similar to those found within fascist nations. And so I'd like to discuss these traits in particular. The first and most important trait I would like to discuss is this idea of state control of society. And the idea here is that a nation run by a fascist government has complete and total control of every aspect of society, whether that's education, the media, religion. They are all seeing and they control every bit of it. And when we look at the trial, I'd specifically look at chapter 9 of the trial. The character of the priest is introduced, and he makes it clear to Joseph K. that he is in association with the court and the law that's overseeing his trial. And while Joseph K. has had many other encounters with other individuals who inevitably reveal their association with said government, or rather bureaucracy, Joseph K. comes to the realization that no matter where he goes or who he talks to, this bureaucracy that oversees him is everywhere, no matter what, right? And so the idea here is state control of society influences what people see and what people know, right? And so that goes back to prosecutorial misconduct, because the idea of prosecutorial misconduct is to convince the jury of something completely different from the truth. And that's typically what a fascist nation or a fascist government and their leaders would try to do to their people. And even if somebody were to disagree with said leaders, the leaders would not hesitate to have their own methods of enforcement, which is the next trait we'll be looking into, methods of enforcement. The idea here is to punish those who stay out of line or do not meet the status quo of said society, yes? And so an example of this in chapter 4 of the trial is the infamous whipping scene, in which a flogger whips the two men who had arrested Joseph K. at the beginning of the novel. And Joseph K. is mortified by the scene. because Joseph K. was the one, after all, who had reported these men to the law in regards to certain complaints he had made. And so they are simply enforcing their rule, their fist of iron, if you will, to these individuals, right? And so this also goes back to prosecutorial misconduct, because in prosecutorial misconduct, the idea is to give the defendant a harsher than necessary punishment over what exactly? Well, over the conviction that the prosecutor gives them, right? As a result of state control of society. The two interconnect really well, yes? And so that's why I would like to discuss Michael Morton, yes? Michael Morton, in December 25th of 1986, was arrested and charged for the murder of his wife, Christine Morton. And the subsequent month, he was guilty. He was claimed guilty of the crime that he had supposedly committed, yes, and was sentenced to life. And so for the next 25 years, he had the perseverance to continue fighting for his innocence. And thanks to the help of the California Innocence Project and two other members of said project, he was freed on October 4th, 2011, after he had a DNA test that revealed Mark Allen Norwood as the true perpetrator of the crime. And so what we find out is that Ken Anderson, the prosecutor of the trial of Michael Morton at the time, had hid evidence away, specifically of an interview conducted with his son, who had stated that a man with a mustache had been the one who murdered his mother. And this was hidden for years to come, and even during the trial. And so what we see here is Ken Anderson committing prosecutorial misconduct, specifically hiding the evidence, you know? And so when we look at both Joseph K. and Michael Morton, what we can understand between the two of them is that they are victims of prosecutorial misconduct. Joseph K. was never, in the novel, he was arrested for a crime. But the thing is, to the audience of Joseph K., it was never revealed what the crime was. And that falls in line with the idea of prosecutorial misconduct and the violation of the Sixth Amendment of the US Constitution, in which he should have known the seriousness of his charges and the evidence against him, but was never informed of it. And the same can be similarly said about Michael Morton, in the sense that evidence was withheld from him from Ken Anderson, and he had no idea who his prosecutor was, and although he was aware of the seriousness of his conviction. And so the other difference I'd like to notice is the difference between their willpower and resolve to fight this. By the end of the novel, Joseph K. succumbs to the law and succumbs to his fate. He inevitably dies at the end of the novel, with little to no fighting spirit for his innocence. Because we also, as I mentioned before, he was never explained to in regards to his conviction and the evidence against him. Whereas Morton, he had the resolve and will to keep fighting for his conviction years after he was in prison, or rather during his imprisonment. He fought and even earned a degree during his time in prison. And so what I'd like to take away from this discussion, specifically a couple of things. The trial was published back in 1925, and it is quite an old novel. And despite how old it is, no matter how old any piece of literature is, the themes and the context within literature will always stay the same. And however, despite that being a true statement, it also goes to show that because of the relevancy of the themes and context within the trial to the modern day American criminal justice system, it means that we have failed to prevent this from happening, and we need to take steps in order to stop that, right? The system needs to be reevaluated and challenged. And so I'd like to point out an organization that I had mentioned earlier, the California Innocence Project. Specifically, however, these guys are the individuals who fight to get people out of death row or life sentences. But overall, their intentions are to challenge the criminal justice system. And if you want to help, I would advise going to them. I would like to thank you for joining me today in this presentation. Here are my references. And again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that we can make the changes within the criminal justice system necessary in order to prevent the Sixth Amendment from being violated and from spreading traits of fascism within the American justice system. Thank you so much.